Good Sunday evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Talking TSR with Chris and my co-host Rick to my virtual right or left, whichever it happens to be. Hey, Rick, how's it going?
I'm doing good. Weather's getting colder, autumn, which I
Yeah,
love. Uh,
yes. Happy
coming
pumpkin
up.
season.
Yeah, an early happy Halloween.
Yes, yes. Happy
My
Halloween.
favorite time of the year. No,
Yeah.
I'm digging it, and my group has gone. I guess you could say hybrid. We've kind of followed
Oh,
the same path as many businesses and medical practitioners and what have you, because we have a fellow in Texas, so we're piping him in via Zoom. But I have people from here in New Jersey right at my table.
nice.
So, I like to think that one of the, I guess, silver linings of the whole pandemic thing is a lot of us gamers are learning different technologies and different ways to connect with our fellow players. So it's kind of that's the one good thing.
Nice. Excellent. Well, yeah. Well, actually, in November sometime, I'll be starting a super secret play test that will
Mm.
probably not be announced for a while. And we're going to be doing it all virtually just because we have folks in Pennsylvania, folks in New Jersey, and we even have one of the Goodman Games folks who's all the way out in California, I believe. So he's been chomping at the bit to play some more 5e. So we got a group together and we're going to start doing something really, really fun and exciting. And I can't wait. It's just like, I'm looking real forward to it. And my local 4-H is creating a D&D club and they reached
Oh
out to
wow.
us. Yeah, so I'm like, I'll probably have two games going on. Hopefully I'll stagger them apart so I have like one a week or something like that. So yeah, it's exciting and it's kind of interesting. I think I always kind of envisioned my role-playing campaigns way back in the day, back in the 80s. We always started them in the fall,
Hmm.
and then obviously summer, summer vacation would come and people would start going their own direction and everything. But this was kind of
Hmm.
the classic time of the year to like start up
Yeah.
your campaign and kind of get back into it. So
Hmm.
which is awesome. So
Very true.
yeah,
Nice.
love that. So, real quick, folks, announcement: Empire of the Cyclops Con's coming up in just 2 weeks. So that's November 5th to the 7th. So everybody check that out. We have the return of the charity auction on Friday night, and I've been putting together the list of all the items. There's a lot of really, let's call it eclectic items, things that you can't just walk into a store and buy, which is awesome. And there's going to be the next episode of Down the 5e Pike will be premiering. I think that's Friday night, I think at 6 p.m. Eastern. So you guys might want to check that out. You never know if we have any kind of exciting 5e announcements. You never know. You never know. So that's that. Well, all that's out of the way. Tonight, we are here to talk about what's over my shoulder. Assault on the Aerie of the Slave Lords, A3. So we decided we were going to do all four of these A modules, and we got to get through this one. So this one's definitely not our favorite, but we're going to try and find some good things on it, and kind of tell you some things that you might want, some reasons you might want to check this guy out.
Mhm.
So with that, how about Rick? Why don't you give me your aerial view of your
Top
airy
level.
view of what you think about this module, and we'll go
All
from
right.
there.
My aerial view of the Aerie. I guess yes, and truth in advertising, as you say, this is probably my least favorite of the four, but I love this series, and it is a component of the four. It is an essential lead in, I think, to A4. So it's a component of the whole. It's such a mixed bag, this one, because you have three separate chapters. You have a very different chapter in the middle. um it is very ambitious, I think, for even a tournament module. That whole city element strikes me as something where they really kind of push themselves a little bit there, and I don't know if it was completely successful, but I'll give them kudos for that. um Beyond that, my main, I guess you could say, observation, and I don't want to echo what I said last week about the Funhouse Dungeon too much, but there is that little bit of a clashing. I think whenever you have a tournament module like this, there's always that headbutting between the tournament function, and
Mhm.
verisimilitude. And it really comes out in this one for me for whatever reason. um I think there are some rooms in here that they work perfectly for tournament purposes, but outside of a tournament environment, they sort of scream, this is a one puzzle room to me a little bit too loudly. Now, again, very subjective, and that's a hard balance to cut. I do think there are some modules that have hit that balance really well, though. I think A1 right in this series, for instance, hits it very well. That plank encounter we described, I think
Mhm.
a show or two ago. Perfect example. You had a puzzle in a room, you had different paths the players could take to get through that plank room, and yet having a plank in this gutted out room because it was in a fire burnt ruin made total sense. So you had
Mhm.
verisimilitude and you had the tournament function. Whereas in this one, it's a little more strained. So I wish there was more of that. I wish this was a little more like A1 or C1, the Hidden Shrine of Timochin, which also I think strikes a nice balance between tournament and verisimilitude. So there's that. That's, I guess, my initial high level impression is if you're not buying this as a tournament module, and presumably most of the folks who bought it back in the day probably didn't, it you feel that when you read it, or I did. It's definitely something that struck me when I went through this now recently as well.
Yeah, and I think that was the key thing. Back in the late '70s, uh, TSR wasn't really looking to publish modules.
Mhm.
But what they were doing, and this is very smart, and Goodman Games has done this a fair amount too, is they held tournaments at
Mhm.
conventions basically to spread word of mouth and to get people excited about D&D because all right, D&D was out for 4 years or so now, but still, and this and it's still actually today the way you generate buzz and the way you get your target audience hooked, if you will, is actually having them play. And you see that. I mean, I mentioned earlier that our local 4-H is starting a D&D club. Well, they're starting a D&D club because there's a bunch of 4-H members who want to play D&D, have watched Critical Role and the other shows on TV, but they don't know still how to play, and
Mhm.
they don't have a game master, and they're not sure like how to do it and how to actually start
Mhm.
playing. And I think that was why Gygax was a very big proponent of creating these tournaments of a to test the skill of the players, but also just to get the game out there to
Mhm.
get quote unquote live. There wasn't an internet back then. You couldn't
Yeah.
watch
Yeah.
people play. You had to actually go to a physical convention and actually play. And game stores back then, if there were game stores, and there really weren't a lot, that the game stores did not have room to play games, and there wasn't
Mhm.
collectible card games, and there wasn't board game night. A game store back in the day, they sold games. That's what they did. They didn't
Yeah.
do anything else. So really, if you wanted to go to play, you either had to someone had to teach you, a sibling or a relative or a friend, or you had to go to a convention.
Mhm.
And so I think you get that with some of these earlier tournament modules. And
Mhm.
keep in mind, I believe these were created in the '70s, I believe, for
Mhm.
Origins, I believe, if I'm correct. And basically they were like looking around, well, we need the eventually late '70s, early '80s, TSR was like, oh, hey, people will pay money for modules. And
Mhm.
Gygax had trouble figuring that out because he's like, why would you pay for somebody else to create a module for you? Like that's the whole
Yeah.
gig of everything, is to create your own module. And so they were looking around for, well, what can we publish? And
Mhm.
literally, I think they were looking around the office where they could publish. And they were like, oh, well, we did this one tournament at Origins, on
Yeah.
the slave lords. And it's like, hey, well, we could make that into a bunch of books. And I think they did that. And that long-winded way of basically saying is yeah, you're taking a tournament setting and trying to make it a campaign setting,
Yeah.
and then you're probably not doing it justice, probably at the
That's
end
a
of the
really
day.
good point. Taking this from the time period in which it happened, because certainly, obviously, the internet. I think people still forget, even though we jokingly mention it a lot on this show, being old timers. But it's kind of now if you're looking for a DM or you're looking for anything, you can kind of go on the internet and find it
Yeah,
instantly.
yeah.
But back when a lot of these modules came out, even in the '80s, simply finding a DM could be a chore. I mean, I remember seeing columns in some of the
Hmm.
magazines where they would list available DMs by state. It's kind of almost just, really funny when you think about it now. So certainly there's that. You're right. There's that advertising. And some of it might be in a practical matter of how much work they could put in, because they are taking an existing product and they're trying to convert it into something that they could sell. And like, it's my understanding for A2, for instance, that a lot of material was added onto it, whereas I think this module, at least like I understand, the first dungeon part of this is supposedly very close to the
Hmm.
tournament round it was based on. There was almost no changes made. So, perhaps this one got a very light pass as far as additional material or editing. We can't know what went on behind the scenes, but it's a really good point. You have to look at the origin of these, certainly.
Yeah, and so these, you're not getting a whole lot of bang out of your buck for these. You have two basic dungeon crawl parts. You have a
Mhm.
sewer crawl, which is the later part, and then you have a cave crawl. And each of those have 9 encounter areas, and those are like the perfect kind of tournament length, 3-hour tournament length module that you would play back at a convention back in the day. And then you had a middle part, which was the city crawl, which was ironically tacked on to that second half. So
Mm,
so your semifinal round apparently was started in the city and then it went to the crawl, and I find that would probably have been frustrating from a tournament standpoint,
yeah,
because first of all, we're talking the 70s here. Is this the first city crawl that was done? I mean, I don't know if there was a city adventure before this.
yeah,
That must have really taken people off their out of their comfort zone, I would
yeah,
say. He took him out of the dungeon walls and everything. Said, "Here's a big city." There was
yeah,
68 encounters. Of course, 30 of them or 35 of them were not detailed. They were closed
yeah.
shops, and literally there were no details in the module. And basically, it was like, "Here's a city. Go find the entrance
Yeah.
to the sewers." Like the one
Mhm.
entrance to the, well, actually, there's two entrances to the sewers.
Right.
Out of these 68 things, and you get a clue at the very beginning. And like you and I were talking ahead of time, if you didn't latch on to that
Oh
clue,
boy.
like if you missed that clue or just ignored
Yeah.
that clue or something, you probably wandered around
Yeah.
um your 3 hours, probably wandered around the city trying to figure out what to do. And they
Yeah.
mention it several times in the preamble that a good team will get through that city really quickly and will
Mhm.
get to the dungeon part because it's all the same 3 hours. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, that's amazing. Now
Yeah.
taking it full circle back to the campaign, I could see the city part being a lot of fun because, and they
Mhm.
even mentioned it, you could literally spend days, you could spend a couple of sessions just
Yeah.
going around the city and adventuring in there. So,
And I really like that part. I guess that's what I was meaning when I'm saying, calling this an ambitious tournament module, because I can't even imagine at the tournament table when you're under that strict time limit. Time goes so fast in a tournament.
yeah.
Trying to just even for the poor DM, trying to kind of push these characters,
Yeah.
these players through that. And like, yeah, like you said, as part of a campaign, I love that element of this
Hmm.
module. Again, I don't really think it's implemented 100%. I think the ball, didn't quite make it across the goal line.
Yeah.
But as a concept, rooting around this town and trying to find access to the dungeon, especially if it's developed properly and played up as this really sort of seedy,
Hmm.
unusual town that's away from everything, and played up for that darker element, that this isn't your average population center. It could be so cool. And
Yeah.
as you said, really, I think I'm going by memory here, but with the exception of Hamlet, I don't think any other cities or villages or anything were presented in a book before this came out. So
Yeah. Well,
this was
and
one of the first, certainly.
this was very clearly a city, not a village.
Yeah,
This was a city.
yeah,
They made that distinction. It was an isolated city. It was out in the middle
mhm,
of nowhere on an island and everything, and it was definitely in, the underbelly
yeah,
of the seedy part of the city. But it was not a little farming village where
yeah,
there was 30 encounters and everybody knew their name.
hmm,
It really struck you as kind of more of a metropolis kind of a thing.
yeah,
And I think the concept when they were kicking it around was great, and I, like you said, I
hmm,
just don't think the execution was there. Now,
yeah,
but I think part of that could be back in the day, the game master was expected to fill those gaps in.
hmm,
I mean, that was an expectation, and I think if you got a map, you got a list of what everything was, a key that everything was. It was basically, if you want your players to adventure in this site, flesh it out,
yeah,
figure out, fill in the gaps and everything. which is fine. But like I said, back in the day, these modules, these are $5. These modules, $6 or whatever they cost. That was a lot. You wanted everything filled in. I mean,
Yeah.
the last thing I wanted to do was, like, we talked about this. I bought my copy of
Mhm.
B1, and I'm like,
Yep.
what? It's not done. It's like, there's a lot of blanks in it, and I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
want to pay money for something that I need to then go and
Oh,
fill
yeah.
out. And that was the thing. The first couple years when I played, I didn't create my own modules. I
No.
did everything off the shelf, and because I didn't have the comfort or the
Sure.
competence or the knowledge to, like, sit
Yeah.
down and create my own adventure, that didn't come
Yeah.
for a couple of
Well,
years. I was still learning the
again, a
rules.
lot of us didn't have the years of exposure to other DMs. There were certainly not things like Critical Role or these, examples you could watch
Yep.
easily or anything like that. As we've discussed several times, yeah, it's like I remember with the Temple of Elemental Evil when I saw the nodes weren't done, and that was after this huge lengthy dungeon.
Yeah.
I was still disappointed that the nodes.
Yeah.
I was like, "Where's the beef?" Because there was
Yeah.
there was no dungeon there, and certainly this one, there's work to be done. You have so many closed buildings that the players might want to break into and have questions
Hmm.
about. You have this whole sort of citadel of the slavers where the characters could very well go that is not developed, that could be just a huge project, maybe a fun
Hmm.
project, but a huge project. I don't think the city has any residences in it or homes in it that I can even recall being detailed whatsoever. So there's just so much stuff there that needs to be, I think, fleshed out
Yeah.
for it really to sing, again in a non-tournament campaign sort of way. Um, so yeah, it's such a mixed bag because I love that idea of rooting around the city, but the implementation, I don't know. It's just, I feel like we're getting 70% of what we need to really make it work.
Yeah.
Um,
I would agree. So
yeah.
let's talk about the ankylosaurus in the room. And if people know what my little metaphor is there, but a lot of reasons I think why folks don't like this module is the ending of the module, the very railroady ending. And again, it's railroady for tournament purposes. So for
Mhm.
those of you, spoiler alert, for those of you who do not realize, the last module in the series, Into the Dungeons of the Slave Lords, you start captured, and you have none of your equipment. So at the end of this module, figure it out, you have to
Mhm.
end up captured. And they kind of hand wave it, they kind of explain how it happens. I mean, personally, if you look at that final encounter, it's 5 slave lords against probably 9 PCs. The slave lords are all ninth through
Oh, it's yeah,
11th level. Like, they
yeah.
should probably wipe them up anyway. But they kind of get past all that, and they kind of, like, they drop like walls of force, and there's like poison gas and everything. But that turned a lot of people off.
Mhm.
And even in a tournament setting, I could understand where people would really get upset that your character had no your party had no way that they could win, essentially,
Mhm.
that they had to end up captured. I think a better way to do it would have been to let that final encounter play out. If the characters all die, well, then they didn't all die. When you start the next round of the tournament, if they advance to the last round of the tournament, you just tell them, here's how it went. You succumb to the poison, and you start captured. It didn't really matter what happened at the end of that. So I
Mhm.
honestly think that is what gives this module a lot of its poor
Mhm.
way it's received, is because nobody likes that. And I would say even back in the 70s, 80s, it was probably a little bit more accepted. But then
Mhm.
once you got into the late 80s and then the 90s, and certainly as D&D evolved,
Mhm.
railroading your characters and the party into anything was like considered. You just don't do that. It's like a
Yeah,
sign of a bad game master.
yeah.
You never tell them, oh no, you have to go down this corridor, not that
Mhm.
corridor. I mean, that you're taking all the choices away. And this could be the whole topic of a show, that illusion
Mhm.
of that the character that the party has choices, but they
Yep,
really don't have choices.
yep,
But you always give them that illusion that they have
yeah.
choices. So, and I see the chat is like blowing up over here.
Yeah.
People must have read this is I would have thought the chat was going to be really non-existent for this episode, but it is just totally blowing up. So we will get to this once we finish our overall thoughts about this. We're gonna jump into the chat. We're gonna read. We'll discuss some of these. Hopefully, they're worth it. so, um,
um,
so anyway, that I don't know how you feel about the
yeah,
capture at the end.
no, absolutely. You're as it's presented, obviously, you're given two choices. You can either fight the slave lords, which could be a very sometimes one-sided battle, or you're dumped right into A4. And there is certainly the feel that this is just a setup module for A4. Now, I love the concept of A4, and obviously we'll get to that in more detail in our next show, but I love that whole concept of the setup. And I've put, as a DM, I've put my characters, in my campaign into that sort of situation where they've had items lost or stripped away, or they've been put in a disadvantaged position and had to sort of survive. But there's never a delicate way to do it. It's you really can't avoid that railroady sense, because to get from A to B, you know, you basically have to just pull a DM fiat and say, you're captured. And there's just no good way around that. So yeah, unfortunately, I feel like, again, it's a great setup, but you have to go through an ugly path. So yeah, it's and again, even if you don't go that way, just having them fight the slave lords and end where this one ends, where however the battle goes, isn't really satisfactory to me either. So it's in a bad spot. And I certainly think the module can get a lot of heat for that. I think that's what people think of. People who know this module, they
Yeah.
think of that. I mean, I do. When I think of
Yep.
this module, the first things that pop into my head is, for whatever reason, is the salt slide and is the
Yep.
end.
Yep.
That's
That's
like, yeah,
that.
those
That's
are the first two things I
Yeah,
think
it's the
of.
two things that come to my mind on this. And I guess probably Knowles also come to mind. I think
Yeah,
Knowles, I think the salt slide, because of salt slide, that is just like, you don't ever get a salt slide.
right.
And then you're
If it
right. And
wasn't
then that,
salt, and
yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned the Knolls, because yeah, I mean, one of the kind of cool conceits of this series was every module in the series kind of featured a different base creature, where
mhm,
you had orcs and you had this and you had that. And for this particular module, obviously it's Knolls. And I do like that. I think that's a cool idea, similar to them assigning, certain properties to rooms, having a trap or having a trick or having a creature in a trap,
yep,
the way we described that sort of formula they had, the formula for having a base creature that's different for each module in the series, I think is such a neat idea. I love it. So again, just so many good nuggets here that somehow just didn't come to full fruition.
yeah, I would
So
agree.
yeah, a little frustrating. Another thought, this I guess I have to express, is I love the maps visually, but then when I go into the editing, I find some deficiencies there, or some weirdities there. There's things that are called out in the text that look different on the map, or somehow in editing were lost. There's at least one or two false doors that don't appear.
Hmm.
The first module always messed me up, because they describe the initial passages, and we can get that, the cave map up there. Put that up, Alana. There's a lower section in particular where you have entry passages coming up, and they look very squared off and they look man-made. And anybody, to me, looking at this map is probably going to describe it that way to their players. But then in the text, they tell you that they're natural passages. And it looks really odd to me, because that one piercer cavern looks different than the others, and it kind of says, hey, this is a natural area to me, and the rest look very squared off and man-made, but they're not. When you read the
Yeah,
text, you're told that they're natural passages, which I guess is good, because it's such an insane map that, very much in the first 1E feel, to be sure, one of those
hmm,
mazy kind of crazy maps that I can't imagine somebody, paying dwarfs to carve all this out. So I guess it's good that it is natural, but it doesn't look natural. So that always throws me for a curve when I look at the maps, even though they are, again, visually nice. Um, so yeah, just yet another example of something for me that just didn't quite square in this book. Um,
yeah.
at the expense of being nitpicky, that always bugged me.
Um,
So
So our new monster, we only get one new
Mm,
monster in this module, the Stow Roper.
mhm.
So give me some initial thoughts on what you think about the Stow Roper. Oh, and first, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't the Stow Roper in Temple of Elemental Evil on one of your levels? Wasn't there a Stow Roper
Yes,
in there? So
yes.
you actually converted to the fifth edition, didn't you?
Hmm. Yes,
Awesome.
I
So
have.
this is perfect. So what do you think of the Stow Roper?
Yeah, I don't mind the Star Roper. I'm not always a fan of kind of bumping up a creature, but in the case of the Star Roper, I don't know why. It to me, I guess it felt natural. If I think after seeing the Adiug and Neo Adiug in the original Monster Manual, seeing a Star Roper, the fact that its skin gave it a sort of camouflage, a little more of a, appearance thing that the DM could play with and kind of fool the characters with a little bit. I found it interesting. So yeah, I don't mind the store over at all. I wish we had gotten more new creatures in here.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I have nothing against the store opener. Like so many creatures from these books, it ended up, I think, in the monster manual too, is how it
Yep.
was
Yeah.
officially presented finally. Um, but yeah, I've made use of it myself more than once, and I'm even thinking of using it on a project, on a newer project. So yeah, nothing against the store opener myself. I just wish there was more of it. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I found it interesting. I kind of always like when you take a known monster and give it a little different spin.
mhm,
I think that keeps your characters on edge. They're like, oh wait, this is not doing what I think it's going to do. You kind of play that, kind of
mhm,
play the rules knowledge against them. I
mhm.
like that kind of trope. But again, yes, only one new monster. I would have liked to see two or three, probably. At
Yeah,
least one in each of those dungeons because we didn't get
yeah,
one whole dungeon we didn't get the new monster, so
yeah,
that was
certainly.
a little bit of a disappointment. So all right, well, I think any other final thoughts before we're going to jump in? I want to jump into the chat first. I
Sure.
don't think we've ever had this many chat feedback, so I'm going to run through some of these before
Yeah,
we
let's
jump
do
into
that.
our top five facets. And again, since there's only essentially 18 developed encounters in this module, we figured we weren't going to do favorite encounters. We were going to do kind of your top five overall things from the module, which
Yeah,
could
we'll
be
do
an
a mix.
encounter, it could be a monster, it could be an
Hmm.
NPC, it could be something. So we're gonna do that.
Yeah.
All right, so let me just see if we jump through here. Eager for more updates on Crypto Devil Lich. Yes, you're not the only one. We will have an official announcement on what's going on. Obviously, it's slowing us down. There's obviously a lot of issues in the world right now with paper and shipping and but we are very close to getting that sent out and getting that going. So it's close, guys. It is. We also added a whole lot of stretch goals to that, which obviously whenever you do that, that slows things down. We added a whole nother level. And we had to write those encounters, we had to edit those encounters, we had to do a whole bunch of things in that. So yes, I know, sounds like lots of excuses, but it's coming. It's coming. We're getting real close on that. When will the new or be announced? Yes, it'll be announced when we announce it. And I love this 4-H head, like head, hands, heart, and hacking. I love that. That might have to be our slogan for our new club.
There you go.
Um, Many reasons not to like Critical Role, but respect them for getting the game out there and making it popular. Without a doubt.
Mhm.
I'll be
Yeah.
honest with you, I've
Yeah.
never watched an episode of Critical Role. Everybody knows about it,
Hmm.
and it brings so many people
Yeah.
into the hobby, and
Mhm.
that's a great thing. I mean,
Yeah.
that is not a bad thing at all.
Yeah. Any
Um,
exposure to me the game gets, even when
yeah,
it's humorous, like you see it on Big Bang Theory or something, I like it
yeah,
because it just gets it out there. It makes it a popular thing,
yeah.
a known
Totally
quantity.
agree. Two-edged sword, positive contribution to the hobby outweighs its quirks. Exactly how I feel. Okay, yes. Okay, now we're getting back into the module here. Yes, too much. Yeah, yeah. Have you ever read? Yep, B1. We talked about B1.
Yeah.
Yes, Errol Otis. Yes, yes, Errol Otis. Right, home brewing is half the fun. I would agree. At this
Yeah.
point, I would agree. But again, back
Yeah.
in the early '80s, I was not about home brewing. So
Yeah.
so these things really, really, I had a completely different stance on that, and it's okay to change your stance over time. There's
Hmm.
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, my
random
young self
ideas.
wanted everything done, and since Errol Otis was mentioned, let's just throw it out. The module has a really interesting, I'd say, eclectic selection of art.
Yeah, but
I do
solid.
like,
Yeah,
some of the D art and stuff. I love.
yeah.
I love the one pickpocket.
Hmm.
The guy kind of sauntering, looking like a kind of smug Sean Bean, leaning against the door. I
Yeah.
love it. But yeah, what a mix of art styles in this book. So we were complaining about the lack of art, I think, in the previous book. So at least in this book, we got a nice selection of art. So
I would
kudos to
agree.
them for
I,
that.
I love the back cover picture, the Ankylosaurus. Actually, if
Hmm.
Elena, if you can throw that up there, I think it's
Yeah.
a a great piece.
Mhm.
And one of those things where the players, they might accidentally see your back cover and, oh my God, there's a dinosaur in this module,
Yeah.
and there kind of is. So it's kind of
Right. In
interesting.
this case, it might be good if they actually see that picture.
Exactly, exactly. Kind of completes it. It's like, oh, it's like, well, it's definitely a dinosaur if they put it on the
Yeah.
back cover. Yep. The let's see, G Blaster never played a module straight. Yep, as read. Yeah, back in the day,
Mhm.
I did play the module straight. So yep. Read through Curse of Strahd and hated the way. Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of people have different ways that they start Curse of Strahd. Created a whole new section. Yep, good call on the whole. Yep, mists. Yep. Well, that was the thing back at Ravenloft, the original Ravenloft, the whole Mist of Ravenloft. That was a whole running gag. Every time you went to a tournament and you didn't know what the setting was, and they said the mists closed in on you, you were like, "Oh crap, we're going to Ravenloft,"
Yeah.
and they hated it. Um, yep, creepy. Yep, yep. Oh, that sounds. Oh, there's people are putting some good ideas in here.
Yeah.
On how to start the modules. Cool. Yep. G Plaster, Otis. Yep. Managed Lightning. Yep. Yes. Yes. You know
Yeah.
what? Errol Otis and lightning bolts. I mean,
I
that has
know.
got to
I
be
know.
his. He is like really. He gets more use out of them
Yeah.
than anything, and he just shows them in different
Mhm.
ways, going through bodies in different
Yeah.
directions and stuff like that. So yes,
Yeah.
he's definitely got that down.
No,
So
I know that cover of to Sojourn is one of my all-time favorite pieces. We have to get him on the show at some point. We
we
have to.
should. If folks want him on the show, let us know. That would
Yeah,
be a great idea.
that would be
We could
fun.
reach out to him and we can get
Yeah,
him on.
we can try to make that
That would
happen.
be great, just to pick his brain about all these classic
Hmm.
ones. What we should do is we should get a bunch of his artwork and pull it up and then see if he remembers where it's
Hmm.
from.
Yeah, yeah,
Test him at that. So all right, we've caught up on all of the chat. So that was awesome, guys. Thanks for the chat.
nice.
That's really cool.
Appreciate the input. Yeah.
Yeah, so we are going to now jump into our top 5 facets of this module. And Rick, I think I started last time, so let's like have you kick it off this time and see how
All
many
right.
crossovers we get.
Sure. It's always fun seeing where we cross. But again, we're going to cover both encounter areas and other general concepts in this. So we'll see. I do have an honorable mention, so I'm gonna lead with that.
Okay.
My honorable mention is the aforementioned salt slide.
Okay.
I think it's fun. I think it's different. The whole salt idea. I do like the fact that there's a little clue as to the nature of the salt slide when you kind of find these bark toboggans or whatever they are in the room before it. And for some reason, that little stupid salt slide sticks in my head whenever I think of this book. That's the first thing that jumps
Mm-hmm.
into my head after all these years is that salt slide. And I think again, it rubs that same itch as the plank encounter. It's just one of these, it's a bone simple encounter at its heart, but it's fun, it's memorable. I've had players who still remember it when I've run them through it. I remember it as a DM running it and reading it. So for that reason, I'll throw that out as a quick honorable mention.
Okay.
Um, but do you have an honorable mention actually
I
before I go
do.
into
I do
it? Okay, go
actually.
for it.
So there's the pit trap, which I think is in the second
Hmm.
dungeon. I didn't write down the number for it, but it's a simple pit trap. The pit's only 7 feet deep, and there's sand at the bottom, so you take no damage when you fall into it. But then
Hmm.
there's a nozzle that shoots flame.
Mm.
If you don't fall into the pit, it shoots flame across. And the idea, and that in itself is okay. All right, not a
Hmm.
big deal there. But what's really interesting is kind of the backstory of why the designers created that encounter. The thought process there was if you captured a slave lord up in the city
Hmm.
and you were forcing the slave lord to lead you to his lair and where the other slave lords were down and through the sewers, arguably he would be going first. So you would
Hmm.
be pushing him first ahead, especially if there was any traps. The slave lord would fall into the pit, not take damage. the characters would take damage from the fire, and then there was apparently there's option for a secret door to be at the bottom of the pit, and then the slave lord could go out through the secret door and
Yeah.
escape. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Hmm.
So that was an honorable
Yeah.
mention. Didn't make my list, but I thought it was kind of neat. So,
Yeah, I agree. And they certainly gave thought to the slave lords being a very canny group of people, that were not
that they
easily
thought these
pinned
things
down.
through.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
overwhelmed. I mean, they're
Yep.
certainly presented as I almost wish we got more background on them, or more background of them was somehow incorporated into the module, because they are a presence, and I think they could really be developed into something cool.
Yeah.
All right, jumping right into my number five is an area. Again, a little simplistic area, but I like it. Is the cave area in the second dungeon level, which is named the Grotto of Terror. Um, it's a good atmospheric cave. This is the place where there's a large cave and it's filled with water, and there's completely filled with leeches of the characters go across. And yet there's a mechanism by which thinking characters can use caps from giant mushrooms and float their way
Mhm.
across. And if they don't, they can run into a very nasty surprise going along the side route, via a plant monster that attacks them there. So there's a couple different things going on in this room, which I like, different paths, which I like. Again, plus the really cool idea of using the caps of the mushrooms for real thinking players. Um, that for me, this room is a perfect example of a room that does jive, where you have realism and it works as a tournament room too. So that's my number five, is the
Okay.
Grotto of Terror.
Excellent. So, my number five is not an encounter. It is the slave lords summary chart of all of their statistics. So,
Mhm.
in the final encounter, you have five slave lords, and they're each ninth through 11th level, which in first edition D&D is pretty high level. And instead of giving you a separate stat box for each of those, they actually did a full page chart
Mhm.
where they actually give all their attributes, because normally you wouldn't get all their attributes in a stat box, by the way. They give you a really neat little section. They give all the saving throws, so you have all those at your fingertips. They
Mhm.
gave a nice little summary of your attack, your missile adjustment, and your damage bonus that each one did based on its strength
Mhm.
or its magic items. I thought that was amazing because that
Mhm.
just made things easier. And it listed their weapons, their magic items, their spells. And it's interesting that they didn't give you their full spell list, but that's because you weren't really supposed to have a full encounter with them. You were supposed to just
Mhm.
get captured. But they did give you a couple spells, like how they would escape or whatever.
Mhm.
So I just felt that that was a pretty complicated fight with basically a party against a party, and the game master running all of those NPCs. And I just thought that the presentation of the thought process of the author of putting all that on a one-page table,
Mhm.
to make it easier to run at the game table, I love that. I love that
Mhm.
idea. And that really worked for me. And I remember that. That's another one of those things I kind of always remember. I remember the artwork of the slave lords, and I remember that big chart of all their statistics. So that's my
Mhm.
number five, the slave lords summary chart.
Nice. I agree. Because that can be a very complicated. I've run that fight as a DM, both in here and kind of as a sort of final encounter at the end of A4, and running all the slave lords, or having four or five of them even encountering the characters. It's a lot going on. So
Yes.
anything that can make the DM's life easier, I think, is a good thing. My number four is also an encounter area, which would be area A9 in the upper dungeon, which would be the throne room, which is sort of like
Hmm.
your final room. And hopefully I won't be penalized for picking the final encounter. Um, I think this is cool. I've heard a lot of people who are either happy or not happy, because the illusionist is sort of mentioned to be like, I think, an amateur illusionist, even though he's like level 7 or 8. But I like this area. There's some different things going on. We have the Ankylosaurus, and we have gnolls creeping around, and there's use of illusion. Um, and I just think it's a fun tactical encounter. And I find it really interesting that illusions got so much play in first edition and second edition, and that really sort of fell off. It seems like illusions aren't presented as a big part of combat or traps or things in the way they used to, where like Gygax would very lavishly describe a lot of these very tricky illusions that It seems like these early modules, you couldn't go through a module without running into several illusions or illusionists. And now that doesn't seem to be quite the thing. And I sort of miss that in a way because it was cool. It was something that could really confuse your players or, challenge them. So that's my number 4 is the throne room.
Okay. My number 4 is an encounter.
Okay.
It's kind of a fun one. It's a little bit out there. It's area A8, so it's right before the throne room, and that's
Mm.
the spiked door room. So
Ah.
this is a stone room, and encased in the stone room is a wooden room, and it's like
Mhm.
2 feet less around, and there is a simple wooden door exit, and it's 2 feet from the real exit of the door, and apparently the real exit door has spikes on it, and this door obviously doesn't because it's 2 feet, and apparently the door is stuck, and the only way to open up the door is to bash it down. And most of the time, when you bashed it down, the fighter would just throw his shoulder up against the door and bash it down that way. And there was, in first edition, there was all sorts of rules for that. So the thought about this one was if you did that, the door easily will push in. And
Mhm.
then in all these knot holes, and they mention the knot holes in
Mhm.
the read aloud text because the
Mm.
wooden of the wooden room is actually filled with knot holes, and there's knot holes on
Yeah.
the door. The spikes pop through the knot holes,
Mhm.
and then if you throw your shoulder up against it, you're basically throwing yourself up against a spiked door, basically.
Mhm.
And they note in there that you could avoid it by if you throw a big heavy weight like a dead body. I love that that was the one thing there. It's like you throw a heavy weight, like what else you can have available? A dead body against it, and then you can totally foil it and figure out, oh, it's a trap there, and then we can it could be easily avoided. So again, a little bit along that. Does it really make sense? No, it really doesn't. It's very much a tournament vibe, kind of a
Yeah.
challenge kind of thing of how do you figure your way around this.
Mhm.
But I just thought it was a neat concept, and
Mhm.
obviously it took a lot of thought. And and the added addition of the mentioning the knots,
Mhm.
the pine wood knots, I thought was kind of a neat little touch. So that's my number 4, the spiked door trap.
Nice. And that is a devious. Yeah. I mean, taken in the context of a tournament presentation, I think it's a great area. And there's so many rooms in this that you really have to take in that way.
Yep.
Um, and looking at the comments, yeah, I agree, Sky, that I think the illusionist class was always a hard class to play.
Very much.
I think back in the day, honestly, I went more for evokers because I wanted to throw real fireballs. But as a DM, I certainly enjoyed the illusionist element. Though there were spells, I think, you had phantasmal force in certain spells that could be really effective, very real or very impactful. So I guess it depends how you play it. But I agree with you. I wasn't a great illusionist player. I liked the idea of the class. I just wasn't great at playing it myself. It was more of a DM thing for me. All right. Launching
Real
back.
quick before that,
Oh, go
Zerathon,
ahead.
we're on for probably another half hour. So, well, maybe not half hour, good 15, 20 minutes.
All
So,
right. Yeah.
uh, and I agree that the Bard subclass illusionist would be very, very good for 5th edition. So,
Mhm.
yes. So, we're on to your number
Three.
3, I think.
All
Yes.
right. Yeah. I think we're on number 3. All right. And I sort of raised this point a little bit earlier. This is a kind of concept in that, flawed though it may be, I really love the city search element of this module. I want to take it and steal it and use it in something. The idea, particularly in a sort of hostile city or a seedy city, that kind of element, criminal element city, of the characters going from business to business, place to place, searching for clues, speaking to people, getting little hushed whispers, bribing people or whatever, and getting information and going almost on the scavenger hunt from business to business,
Hmm.
looking for access to the underground. I love it. I think it's such a cool concept that, again, I want to kind of steal it and use it myself because it's something different. It's especially if there's a time element at play and not maybe as constrained play wise at the table as real time like a tournament, but I mean like an urgency of the characters felt like they've got to run around the city and find something within a day or two. I think there's some cool applications there for play. Again, especially the city itself is really played up like its own character and sort of given atmosphere. And this city certainly has that in spades, both from its location and its isolation and the fact that the slave lords just really kind of hover over everything in the city. You have that atmosphere here in spades. So I think it's just a matter of developing it up. So that's the element I'm going to call as my number three is
Nice.
the whole city, search the CD city for, clues to the next part. That's my number three.
Cool. Okay. All right. My number three, we have a crossover.
Uh-oh.
So the throne room, A9. Yeah,
Ooh.
love. You guys know me by this point. I love big, complicated encounters. And this is definitely that. Big throne room with pillars. I'd have to say this is probably one of the rooms that I've always remembered, throne room pillars, and I've probably done dozens of rooms like this I've created where you get a big throne room, lots of space to move around, pillars cover, lots of different things. Elena, you can pop up the Ankylosaurus picture, the back cover, if you want again. I love that the illusions, they kind of hand wave how the illusions work a little bit. Okay.
Mhm.
And it was kind of a little, yeah, the illusionist was a loser, but he apparently could command all these illusions and they couldn't be disbelieved normally. But what I do love the fact that I love that things aren't as they seem. So the undead gnolls were not undead. So
Mhm.
the cleric will probably waste around trying to turn them. I love that. The
Mhm.
Ankylosaurus, not an Ankylosaurus, it's actually a rust monster. So I love that the fighter's probably gonna, I got this, I'll take care of this, get up there in one swipe and then probably no sword.
Mhm.
But I love that a gem of seeing could basically foil the entire encounter. Like if you
Mhm.
had a gem of seeing, you're not gonna fall victim to any of the
Mm.
illusions. And I love the fact that a few encounters before, there's a hidden gem of seeing.
Mhm.
And I love that trope. I've used it a ton of times. Come on, if you've ever have something that's glued down with sovereign glue, you got to put the universal solvent somewhere nearby so that
Yep.
they have a chance to get it or something. So
Mhm.
so I'm a big proponent of you put a challenge in front of somebody and then you either give them that potion that they don't think is useful or
Mhm.
some other thing that they're not sure that a 10-foot pole or why do I have iron spikes and oh iron spikes would come in handy now. So I
Mhm.
love that trope, and I love the fact that they utilize this for this. And like I said, it's just a big, awesome, complicated encounter with
Mhm.
with a little sub map with the little locations where everybody
Mhm.
starts. I love that too. So that's my number three, area A9, the throne room.
I agree. It's and I guess that's why I made my list. But yeah, great tactical encounter. And it's a good point you mentioned about because I do the same thing. I guess most DMs, we try to, make things fair. At the end of the day, we're not trying to kill our players' characters. We're trying to challenge them, and it's kind of putting those elements in there, those pieces for them to use later. I like to say if I put in basilisk, I usually have a scroll of restoration laying around somewhere,
Yep.
or Keontum's ointment or something, or whatever it is they can, unpetrify themselves with. And because it's it's important. It may not be in the same place, it may not be easy to find, but like you said, the connection, because I that struck me too when I saw the gem of seeing. I absolutely later put that together with the illusionist, and I didn't really think of it in that way, but it can absolutely collapse that kind of encounter from
Yeah.
the illusionist standpoint, make his life more miserable. So yeah, great encounter. All right, so let's roll on to my number two. This is another specific area. On the second dungeon level, it's C5, which is the Minotaur Maze. If we could get the
Ah,
Minotaur Maze map up.
mhm.
I really like this little pocket area. I think it's so cool. Certainly, the Minotaurs saw appearances in different early modules.
Mhm.
They weren't a
Oh yeah.
monster you didn't see, but there weren't too many Minotaurs in mazes. Um, and it's one of those things where you didn't feel like you would see that too often unless the module was really kind of based on the Minotaur, dedicated to the Minotaur. I mean, Goodman games, we've done some things with Minotaurs. I think Harley did at least one Minotaur maze
Mhm.
in an early module that was really great. Um, but I just don't recall seeing that many minotaurs in maze-like environments in these early modules, and this was one exception that stuck out for me. And I love the presentation. I like the fact that the minotaur is using the missile weapon, and kind of, they go to great lengths in the text of describing,
Hmm.
these quarrels zipping, or these bolts zipping out of the dark at you, and then he runs away. He's using hit and run tactics. There are dead end traps, and this guy is really, made the best of this maze, and is trying to use it against you in a very tactical way. And to me, fighting your way rather than just a random maze of corridors that don't make a whole lot of sense. Here, it does make sense because it is the kind of microcosm of this Minotaur. It's you get the sense it's his little lair, and he owns it, and he's made it into what he can. So for those reasons, I love it. It's probably my favorite area of the whole bottom dungeon is the Minotaur maze. So that is my
All
number
right.
two area, C5.
And and a couple people in the chat are saying that they would love a one-shot Minotaur maze. So I got two for you. In Ore number 4, the Lost
Mhm.
City, I did a Minotaur maze as a hedge prison, so it was kind of like a little demi-plane. You'd easily pull that out, and if you look carefully at that one, Easter egg alert here. It's based off, in my opinion, a very famous maze that's out there, very popular in the '80s. And the other one is, and Rick alluded to it, as Harley did back in the 3.5 days. Harley did a Minotaur one-shot module,
Yep.
Hall of the Minotaur, I believe it was, or Halls
Mhm.
of the Minotaur. And that was in, a lot of people might not have that module because that was actually, I believe, DCC 35A, because that
Yeah.
was included with the box set, the campaign setting. So
Mhm.
if you didn't buy the Aerith box set, you probably didn't have that module, but I think it's available as a PDF. I don't know if those things are sold anymore. I'm not sure they are. I don't think they
Yeah.
are.
I don't know if it.
So, but
Um,
anyway, so there's your two Minotaur one shots there for you. No extra charge for that.
and the
So,
frightening thing is, I've got the Aerith box set is very close to me now, and I'm very tempted to grab it and try to pull that out. But yeah, I think Harley knocked, another home run by Harley in that.
oh
And
yeah.
and the only reason I'm not aware of your Minotaur is because I have not read.
Oh, that's right, because you're gonna play it, aren't you?
Yeah, because I'm
Yeah.
playing through it, and it's one of
Uh-oh.
the classic modules that I haven't read.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm closing my ears. I didn't hear that
Yep.
damn.
Well, it was not in the original module. It was all additional material. So,
Okie
um,
doke.
all
Yeah, I
right.
don't know. I don't know how deep we're gonna get into this city, but yeah, it's like that's the only reason I don't know of it is I've purposely kept myself dumb to Lost City material. But
All right. So I think we're on mine number 2, I
two,
think.
number two, go for it.
Yes. All right. So mine is not an area this time. So mine is the detailed tactics in several of the encounters, specifically the two boss encounters, A9 and C9. I love that they
Mm,
break down the tactics and give you basically a round by round. Here's what the NPCs should do. And they preface it with, the game master needs to adjust this based on what the current situation is. But here's, in C9, which is the slave lord encounter. If you get in that, they give you basically the first 4 rounds, and they tell you what each slave lord is going to probably do, what
mm-hmm,
spell he's going to cast, how he's going to maneuver. I
mm-hmm,
love that. That definitely inspired me, and I've used that a lot, because when you get a really complicated encounter, or you get a pretty detailed NPC, it can be a little bit intimidating and overwhelming on how to run that as a game master. It's always a great idea to give some tactics, put them in a sidebar or something like that, to kind of give you that roadmap, I guess I would say, like how this encounter will probably go. And definitely for a tournament, you want to do that because you kind of want those encounters to be run the same way.
mm-hmm,
If one game master's going to lead with the fireball, but the other one doesn't, is that really an even challenge to the two different teams that are going through this? So I think that was kind of a carryover of tournament, but I love that concept,
mm-hmm,
and I've used that concept a lot for some really complicated encounters. I think you can't go wrong with giving the game master some options on where you really think about the spell list, think about the
mm-hmm.
magic items, the environment, and base your tactics off of that. So my number 2 is detailed tactics in the two boss encounters.
Nice. Well, We have another crossover. I have to
But
get a little crossover bell, that I can,
yeah, we did. Ding.
right, or a graphic we could, a
Yeah.
thing that could pop up or something. Um, my number one is the tactical situation maps combined with the detailed slaver tactics. Yeah, I can't echo what you said enough. At this point, both were kind of new. We really hadn't got many blow up maps or detailed tactics. I don't think we ever got round by round tactics before this module.
I don't think so either.
And getting those tactical blow up maps that show all the positions of the people in the throne room and the people in the boss room, super helpful as a DM to have those little abbreviations, knowing where the knolls are behind each pillar or what have you. It's super important. But then combined, when you have such a complicated kind of high level, high stakes encounter as them running into these five slavers, to have that round by round and like kind of like you said, it's been so influential on me. I absolutely took that experience forward even recently when doing the some of the Temple of Elemental Evil work, when detailing some of these
Mhm.
many. I had a lot of the evil clerics because I was doing levels 2 and 3. um Doing the tactics or thinking about what these clerics are going to do round per round, it really got me in that way of thinking instead of just here's a spell list and kind of winging it. It really got me in the way of thinking of a DM of in advance, thinking or taking notes down as to, all right, round one they're going to start with putting mage armor on, and round two they're going to set up an illusion, and then when the characters come through they're going to do this, and thinking in that round by round way. So helpful, and just uber influential for me as a designer. To this day I use that technique. I write out round by round sometimes for important battles. I've done that within the last year, and it all stems from this particular module. So I've dinged this module a lot tonight, but that's my absolute number one because those detailed slaver tactics are just so wonderful that, and I've used them. That concept I've taken and run with it so many times since then. I can't agree more. Heavy number one for to me for the detailed slaver tactics.
Okay. All right. Well, my number one is also not an encounter, and this one you're gonna be intrigued by this one.
Mm.
So, this is the tournament missile fire into melee rules that they
Ah,
added at the
yes.
end of the module.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So again, I love complicated things. Back in first edition, everybody ran it differently. There were rules apparently in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I actually don't remember.
Hmm.
I probably, if I was a really good host of a show, I probably would have pulled that out and actually seen what they were. But these rules actually say that for the tournament they supersede what's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And it's complicated, but basically,
Yeah.
anytime you shot a missile weapon, we call them ranged weapons now, into a melee situation, you had a chance to hit who you weren't aiming for,
Hmm.
basically. And that's because combat was simulated, even though it was one attack, there was a lot of feinting and there was a lot of,
Sure.
parry and a lot of, shifting around and switching spaces and everything. So this was kind of simulating that. And it was complicated. So basically the whoever was shooting assigned a target, then the game master assigned numbers to all of the people in the melee based on their size. So, like
Yeah.
for example, a small target would be a half of a one.
Hmm.
A medium-sized target would be a one. A large-sized target would be 1.5, and then a huge target would be two. And then you see how many you have, and then you roll a die eight, and then you assign those numbers. So, like you could have. I think the example they put in there was a halfling and two gnolls.
Hmm.
I think if you rolled on that die eight, if you rolled a 1 to 3, you hit null number one. If you're 4 to 6, you hit a null number two. Now nulls were each large sized creatures. You had a halfling, which was if you rolled a 7, and then if you rolled an 8, it didn't hit anybody or you re-rolled or something like that. So it was complicated, but if you were
Hmm.
a really good game master, you could kind of figure it out on the fly. You could kind of sit there and you can kind of do the math in your head, and it just brought a realism in it, and I love that rule. I remember
Hmm.
when I ran this module and we came across this rule, I used it all the time. I used it all the time through first edition and second edition. So I
Mm,
probably used it for like 15 years of gaming.
wow.
And people didn't like it at first, but then after a
Mhm.
while they kind of got used to it. It basically taught you don't shoot into melee
Yeah.
is really what
Yeah.
it taught you. I mean, that's basically because it was like, hey, it's too random, it's too chaotic. And I think it was in third edition, I think they gave you a -4 to hit, I think it was. If you shot into melee, and in fifth edition, you're at disadvantage, I think, or somebody's at
Yeah.
disadvantage. I forget how it is. But anyway, they've tried it. But this,
Mhm.
I love this. Again, it
Yeah.
made things complicated, but it brought some realism to it, and it really, really made you think twice about just hanging back and peppering your arrows
Yeah.
into a melee where other people were. Really made you kind of move around and kind of, and then you get into those arguments. Well, if I go from this angle over here and I get a straight shot because it's like there's
Mhm.
nobody else, and it's like, oh yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. So
No, it makes perfect sense, and it's funny you mention it because I always reread these modules fresh, obviously before our shows, and literally the last thing I read in the module, I reread in the module before this show a day or two ago. What were those rules?
hmm
And I found myself smiling because I didn't remember those, and
yeah,
they make perfect sense. I love the size assignments. Yeah, there's a little bit of math kind of involved in there, but I kind of read it thinking I'm going to steal this because I've always used some version of that. I
hmm
usually my players are used to me spitballing something, a
yeah,
lot of times to this day, I don't even know what the official 5e rules are for, that, but I usually say something if the characters want to do it or the players want to do it. I usually say something like I'll warn the players, DM to players. I'll say you can do it, but
yep,
if you roll a 1 or 2, then you're probably going to hit an ally, and then I
yep,
have them roll the attack. And if they get a really bad roll, then they end up hitting the ally. And usually that's
yeah,
the way I kind of wing it.
yep,
Uh, but because I've always believed in that sort of friendly fire that I just feel
yeah,
like with all, like you said, with all the feinting and stepping around and motion going on in a sword fight, the idea of somebody maybe across the room shooting, across the room and with bows and arrows and trying to hit it, it's got to be hard. So
yeah, yeah,
I always
yeah,
favor that kind of rule, not as a way to kind of quote unquote screw the players, but just because it makes sense. It's just
yep,
something that it inherently would be hazardous to do,
yeah.
So,
But
um,
if it was a halfling and a red dragon, most likely
yeah.
you're going to hit the red dragon.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, most likely
Yeah.
you're going to hit the red dragon. So
No,
I kind of like
that's the
that a lot.
beauty of it is it
Yeah,
totally makes sense because they're saying, hey, if this guy's fills up more space, he's probably going to be the one who gets, pin cushioned here. So, yeah, no, it's a great little system. And if you break it down and look at it, it's really not even that hard.
no,
Um,
it's not. It's not.
it's something that I think when you first kind of scan it, it looks intimidating, but then when you break it down, most creatures are, a half or a
Yeah,
full, and you can kind of
and
just sum it up really quick.
yeah, and what's something that is hard? G Blaster's got it. Trying to find a rule in the DMG in the first edition DMG. Yes, we did a whole show on that, G Blaster.
Yeah.
If you haven't checked out our show, we love the first edition DMG, but oh my
Yeah.
God, don't try to ever find anything in there because it could be in an appendix, it could be in chapter 1, it could be in chapter 20, or it could be like in with another section hidden, and it's a golden rule, and it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, we're just gonna throw it in there. So,
That's right.
um,
And
but yes, but
yes,
love the
G
book.
Blaster. I love the comments.
Yes,
Yeah, I know. Logic, I say. Yeah, I like the joke. I look
yes,
for realism in a game with, flying, lizards with wings that belch fire, but
yes.
it is what it is.
All right.
Eh, All right.
So
I think we're at the end.
we are at the end. So tell us about our next show, Rick.
Sure. We are coming back at you on November 14th at our usual time at 8 p.m. That is a Sunday. And we're going to go into the last entry in the series. We're going to delve right in, finish off the Scourge series, and we're going to go into the Dungeon of the Slave Lords, which is one of my favorites of this series. I
Agreed.
have a feeling it's up there for you too. So
Oh, it is. It definitely is.
definitely
And a
looking
note
forward to
for
going into that
folks
one.
out there, that will be our 25th episode of Talking
Mhm.
TSR. We are going to actually take a pause after that episode. Don't worry, we're coming back. Let's just
Yep.
call this the end of season 1 if the season had 25 episodes.
Mhm.
But we're going to take a break for over the holidays, but we'll be back in January. We're going to maybe come back with a fresh perspective and obviously some cool shows.
Mhm.
Maybe we're going to try and get a couple more guests on, I think, if we can do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're gonna take a break out, but yes, please check out our next show on
Yep.
November 14th.
Yep.
And this would be a great time between now and then. Let us know what you guys want to see content wise. This would
Absolutely.
be a great time as we get some ideas and kind of reload.
Yep.
And Rick, what do you want to tell everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, and just to echo that, certainly, while we're on this little sort of creative break, any information you can give us as far as things you'd like to see, books you'd like us to cover, what modules you really want us to talk about that we haven't talked about yet, or any books for that matter, we'll put it on the list. And yeah, if you're watching and you're enjoying us, whether it's live right now on Twitch or you're seeing this later on YouTube, please give us a follow, give us a like. If you're watching on YouTube, ring that little bell and subscribe. It helps us. And please definitely keep up the comments because we do read them. We love to see what you have to say.
Yes, without a
And
doubt.
with that, I think we're ready to dive in with the pearls of wisdom.
Yeah.
Why don't you start this time, Chris? I can't
Okay.
remember who started last time, but why don't
Yeah, that's good. I'll start. We'll go with that. So my pearl of wisdom is so when you're dealing with a really complicated encounter, give the game master all the tools needed
you?
to solve it. Give them that roadmap. Sometimes that's literally a map with the starting locations of the critters. But round by round tactics always a good things. If you've got a NPC with a spell list, give some suggestions on how to cast those spells. Sidebars, use sidebars and stuff because that really calls out attention to things. So you can totally put your tactics into the sidebar to kind of make them stand out, which is really good. But also, if you've got like an encounter that has to do with flying, you might want to actually have rehash those flying rules, or if you have
Hmm.
underwater combat or something like that, rehash the
Yeah.
the underwater combat. Either have those available or review those right before you run the encounter. If you know your characters are going underwater, by all means, before you get to that encounter, make sure you know what those rules are, so
Mm.
things run smoother at the table. So have a roadmap for your encounters, especially your boss fights.
Really solid advice. My weakness was always drowning rules. I always had to go back and look up drowning rules anytime characters would be swimming underwater. And I finally learned to put in little summaries for myself of the drowning rules when I would incorporate that kind of thing. So, absolutely solid advice. All right, my pearl of wisdom, and this sort of riffs a little bit on me talking about this module being torn between its, tournament elements and its realism and what have you. Would be when you're designing a dungeon as DM, and certainly for home play, think in terms maybe of themes, a little bit before you start. I think, and I don't mean a big story theme. I just mean a kind of theme for a dungeon, a base model, base monster, because I think there's a tendency to just design room after room and wing each one as you go and just come up with cool rooms. And I think it's better if you sometimes slow down and think about what you want the feel of the dungeon to be. If you want it to be a more trick-filled dungeon or more tactical experience, or if you want it to be an otherworldly experience or a spooky experience, what is the feel you want to get from that dungeon? And put that firmly in your head. All right, I want this dungeon to be a very tactical, humanoid laden affair with this creature being the base creature. And if you get that in your head solidly before you start, I think that's a great foundation to then, build off your dungeon from that. So that is my pearl of wisdom.
All right, excellent. So great. And the comments keep flying in. Um, yes, great advice, Rick. Oh, and they want you to dress up as the dungeon master next
Oh
time.
boy.
Probably because I'm wearing that.
Maybe the next
So
Halloween show.
yes, so that would be November 14th. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks you guys for hanging in there. We did it. We got through A3, Aerie of the Slave
We did
Lords,
it.
Assault on the Aerie of the Slave Lords. Too many A's there. And we will be happy to see everybody 3 weeks from tonight. And we're gonna finish off the Slaver series A4 into the Dungeons of Slave Lords. Everybody have a wonderful what's little bit left of your weekend, and a great week coming up. Take care, everybody.
Good night, folks.